It was supposed to be a normal interview, but within seconds, everything completely changed. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn? Make sure to subscribe to Table Turn and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. When Johnny Depp walked out onto the stage that morning, the atmosphere inside the studio felt exactly the way longtime viewers of The View would expect. The audience applauded warmly, the co-hosts smiled in greeting, and the exchange started with the kind of light back and forth that typically opens celebrity interviews. Whoopi Goldberg, seated at the center of the table, leaned forward slightly as she welcomed him, offering a measured but friendly introduction that acknowledged both his decades-long career and the renewed public attention surrounding him. The segment had been promoted as a conversation about Depp's latest film project and his recent return to directing. The show's producers clearly intended to strike a balance between celebrating his work and addressing the broader cultural conversations that have surrounded him over the past few years. From the very beginning, the tone felt professional and structured, with Whoopi guiding the pacing the way she often does, allowing space for thoughtful responses while keeping the discussion moving. Johnny appeared calm, almost reserved. He spoke softly, occasionally smiling, sometimes pausing to gather his thoughts. His posture was relaxed but attentive. He thanked the hosts for having him and spoke about the creative process behind his new project, describing how stepping behind the camera again allowed him to focus on storytelling rather than headlines. The audience responded positively to those comments, clapping lightly at moments that felt reflective or sincere. For the first several minutes, the conversation stayed firmly centered on his career. Sunny Hostin asked about the emotional depth of the character he portrayed in the film, and Depp responded by discussing how he approaches complex roles. Alyssa Farah Griffin brought up the challenges of returning to the industry after public controversy, but she phrased it carefully, framing it as a question about resilience rather than scandal. Johnny acknowledged that it had been a difficult period, but emphasized his commitment to his craft. Whoopi listened carefully, nodding occasionally. She has a distinct interviewing style, measured, direct, but rarely confrontational, without purpose. It was clear she intended to eventually address the subject that many viewers were waiting for, but she allowed the conversation to settle first. That patience created a sense of calm before the more serious turn. About halfway through the segment, Whoopi shifted slightly in her chair and adjusted her glasses, a subtle signal to regular viewers that she was about to steer the conversation into more substantial territory. Her tone remained even, but the phrasing became more pointed. She acknowledged that Johnny's legal battles had been widely covered and that public opinion had been deeply divided. She said that, as a show that discusses cultural accountability and public responsibility, it would feel incomplete not to address that part of the story. The audience reaction was immediate but quiet, a collective stillness rather than noise. The applause stopped. The energy in the room tightened. Johnny's posture changed just slightly. He leaned back instead of forward. His expression remained composed, but his smile faded. He folded his hands loosely in his lap and waited for the full question. Whoopi asked, in a controlled and respectful tone, how he reflects on that period now and whether he feels any responsibility for the broader conversations about power, relationships, and public perception that emerged during the trials. She was careful not to accuse, but she did not soften the core of the question.
It was direct.
There was a noticeable pause before Johnny responded. He took a breath and said that he understood why people had strong feelings. He spoke about feeling misunderstood and about wanting the public to see the full picture rather than fragments. His voice remained steady, but the pace slowed. He emphasized that legal proceedings had run their course and that he preferred to focus on moving forward. Sunny nodded, but her expression suggested she wasn't entirely satisfied. She gently followed up, asking whether moving forward also meant engaging with criticism, especially from advocates who viewed the case as symbolic of larger societal issues. The question wasn't hostile, but it introduced a sharper edge. Johnny responded that he believes in listening, but he also believes in fairness. He said he had experienced a level of scrutiny that felt, in his words, beyond proportion. That phrase seemed to linger in the air. Whoopi tilted her head slightly, considering. Here is where the tension began to build. Not dramatically, not explosively, but in the way live television sometimes shifts when perspectives don't align cleanly. Whoopi clarified that public scrutiny often follows public figures, particularly when cases become cultural flashpoints. She said that for many viewers, the case wasn't just about two individuals. It became part of a larger discussion about how society responds to allegations and accountability. Her tone remained calm, but the firmness was unmistakable. Johnny replied that he understood the broader context, but he also stressed the importance of due process and personal truth. He said that being reduced to a headline was something he struggled with. As he spoke, his hands moved slightly, small gestures that suggested frustration held carefully in check. Alyssa attempted to lighten the tone briefly by asking about how art helps him process difficult experiences. The question provided a temporary reset, and Johnny answered thoughtfully. But the underlying tension didn't disappear. It lingered beneath the surface. Then Whoopi returned to the earlier thread. She asked, very directly, whether he believed public figures should accept that their personal lives can influence public discourse, and whether he felt he had learned anything from that experience about responsibility. This time, Johnny's pause was longer. He looked at Whoopi, then briefly toward the audience, then back at the table. His answer was measured but more defensive. He said that he had always tried to separate his work from his private life, and that he felt some narratives had been shaped without full context. He didn't raise his voice, but the warmth from earlier in the segment was noticeably diminished. The audience was silent again. Even the co-hosts seemed acutely aware of the delicate balance unfolding. Whoopi responded by saying that accountability and context can exist at the same time, that one does not cancel the other. It wasn't an accusation, it was a statement, but it created a clear philosophical divide between them. Johnny shifted in his seat. He said he agreed in principle, but he questioned whether the public conversation had truly allowed space for complexity. That subtle challenge, directed not just at Whoopi but at media platforms broadly, introduced the first clear sign of friction. Sunny leaned in slightly, as if preparing to interject, but waited. The timing of live television requires precision, and everyone at the table seemed aware of it. What had begun as a standard promotional interview was now something more layered. Not hostile, not explosive, but undeniably tense. And as the camera cut briefly to a wide shot of the panel and audience, you could sense that this conversation was no longer just about a film release. It had become a careful, live negotiation between public accountability, personal narrative, and the responsibilities of a daytime talk show that prides itself on asking difficult questions. The exchange hadn't escalated yet, but the tone had shifted in a way that every viewer could feel. As the segment continued, you could sense that everyone at the table understood they were now in more delicate territory. The conversation hadn't crossed into open conflict, but the temperature in the room had changed. The earlier warmth was replaced by a kind of careful attentiveness, the kind that happens when no one wants to be misunderstood on live television. Whoopi maintained her composure. She has moderated thousands of conversations over the years, and she didn't rush to fill the silence. Instead, she let Johnny's last point settle for a moment. Then she responded in a tone that was calm but unmistakably firm. She said that complexity is important, but so is clarity. When public figures go through highly visible legal battles, especially ones that spark national debate, the media doesn't just create a conversation, it reflects one that already exists. Johnny listened without interrupting, but his posture told its own story. He was no longer leaning back casually. He sat upright, shoulders slightly squared, hands resting together on his knee. His expression was steady, though less relaxed than before. Sunny stepped in at this point, bringing the conversation slightly closer to the cultural context. She explained that for many viewers, particularly women watching at home, the trial became symbolic. She stressed that while legal outcomes matter, the broader social implications also matter. Her delivery was thoughtful rather than accusatory. Still, it carried weight. Johnny responded carefully. He said he understood that symbolism can attach itself to events, but he reiterated that he believes in judging individuals based on facts presented in court. He emphasized that the verdict had been reached after due process. His tone was even, but there was a noticeable tightening in his jaw as he spoke. The audience reacted with a light ripple of applause at the mention of due process, though it was restrained. It wasn't overwhelming support, but it showed that some viewers were aligned with that perspective. That small reaction shifted the atmosphere slightly again, reminding everyone in the room that public opinion was not monolithic. Whoopi acknowledged the applause with a brief glance toward the audience, then redirected the focus back to the conversation. She said that legal verdicts and public perception don't always move in the same direction. That statement hung in the air. This is where the exchange grew more pointed, though still controlled. Johnny replied that he felt public perception had often been shaped before facts were fully presented. He said that in the early stages of the controversy, he experienced what he described as trial by headline. He didn't raise his voice, but the phrasing carried a clear message. He was not just discussing his personal experience, he was indirectly critiquing media culture. Whoopi responded by reminding him that media platforms, including shows like theirs, often work with information available at the time. She said hindsight can make things appear clearer, but in real time, conversations evolve. Her tone wasn't defensive, it was explanatory. But it was also protective of the role she plays as a moderator. Alyssa interjected gently, attempting to broaden the lens again. She asked Johnny whether the experience had changed how he views public platforms, including talk shows. It was a subtle but strategic question. It invited him to reflect without directly confronting the hosts. Johnny took a moment before answering. He said he respects the importance of dialogue. He said that conversations like this are necessary, even when uncomfortable. However, he added that he sometimes feels those conversations don't always allow room for nuance. That word, nuance, came up again. And this time, Whoopi leaned forward slightly. She said nuance requires participation from all sides. She pointed out that when public figures choose to speak selectively or avoid certain platforms, it can contribute to one-sided narratives. It wasn't an accusation, but it was close to one. The implication was clear. Engagement matters. Johnny's response was measured, but sharper than anything he had set up to that point. He said he had participated extensively, in court, in interviews, in statements, and that at some point, continuing to relitigate the past becomes counterproductive. His voice remained steady, but there was less softness in it. The audience remained quiet. You could almost feel people holding their breath, aware that the conversation was balancing carefully between respectful disagreement and something more personal. Sunny leaned in again. She clarified that accountability conversations aren't necessarily about relitigation. She said they're about learning and acknowledging impact. That phrase, acknowledging impact, seemed to be the heart of her point. Johnny nodded slightly, but his replies suggested disagreement. He said that acknowledging impact is important, but so is correcting narratives that he believes were harmful to him and his family. The word family shifted the emotional tone subtly. It introduced a more personal element. Whoopi responded by saying that no one at the table was dismissing his personal experience, but she reiterated that the public conversation expanded beyond individuals. She explained that many viewers saw the trial as a reflection of systemic issues, not just personal conflict. At this point, Johnny's body language changed again. He crossed one leg over the other and folded his hands more tightly. It wasn't aggressive, but it was closed. He said he understood broader conversations, but he felt that sometimes individuals become symbols against their will. That statement drew a small murmur from the audience, more a shift in collective energy than an audible reaction. Alyssa tried once more to soften the exchange by steering it back toward his work. She asked how he channels personal experience into creative expression. Johnny answered thoughtfully, describing how art can be a form of processing. His voice relaxed slightly during that portion of the discussion. For a moment, it seemed the segment might recalibrate fully. But then Whoopi returned to one final clarification. She said that while art can heal, public accountability conversations don't disappear simply because someone returns to work. She asked whether he feels comfortable engaging with critics who still question aspects of the case. The directness of that question marked the most pointed moment yet. Johnny's expression tightened. He said he doesn't shy away from conversation, but he won't accept what he considers mischaracterizations. He emphasized that he had already faced intense scrutiny. His tone was calm, but the edges were clearer now. Whoopi nodded, but she responded that scrutiny is part of public life. She said it's not personal, it's structural. That distinction seemed to frustrate him. He replied that scrutiny may be structural, but the impact is deeply personal. There was no raised voice, no interruption, but the emotional weight in that sentence was unmistakable. The studio audience remained completely silent now. What had started as an intellectual disagreement about media and accountability had shifted into something more personal. Not explosive, not chaotic, but undeniably tense. And as the cameras continued to roll, you could sense that both Johnny Depp and Whoopi Goldberg were fully aware that millions of viewers were watching, not just for answers, but for how this moment would be handled in real time. By this point in the segment, the conversation had clearly moved beyond promotional territory. What viewers were witnessing was no longer just an actor discussing a new project. It had become a live exchange about responsibility, public narrative, and the tension between personal truth and collective perception. And yet, even with that weight hanging in the air, the tone remained recognizably daytime television, measured, deliberate, careful not to spiral. There was a noticeable pause after Johnny's last remark about scrutiny being structural, but impact being personal. Whoopi let that sentence sit for a moment. She has long relied on silence as a tool, and this was one of those moments where silence spoke as loudly as words. The audience didn't clap. No one shifted loudly in their seats. It was the kind of quiet that signals attentiveness rather than discomfort. Whoopi then spoke, and her voice was steady. She said she didn't disagree that impact is personal. In fact, she acknowledged that public controversies take a toll on everyone involved. But she added that when situations become cultural flashpoints, they inevitably expand beyond the individuals at the center. She emphasized that the show has a responsibility to reflect that broader conversation, not just the perspective of the guest. Johnny listened, eyes focused directly on her. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he nodded once, slowly. But his response carried a subtle firmness that hadn't been present earlier in the interview. He said he understood the role of the show. He said he wasn't asking anyone to avoid difficult topics. But he also suggested that sometimes these discussions can feel less like conversations and more like reaffirmations of narratives that have already been decided. He was careful with his wording, but the implication was clear. He felt boxed in by the framing. Sunny responded almost immediately, though not sharply. She clarified that asking direct questions doesn't mean conclusions have been predetermined. She explained that for many viewers, particularly those who felt deeply connected to the themes raised during the trial, the questions still matter. Her tone remained composed, but she leaned slightly forward, signaling engagement. Johnny replied that he respects viewers' concerns. He said he doesn't dismiss anyone's feelings about what the case represented to them. But he reiterated that he cannot accept being reduced to a symbol of something he does not believe reflects his lived experience. That phrasing, reduced to a symbol, stood out. Alyssa interjected gently, asking whether he believes it's possible for two realities to coexist, his personal truth and the broader social meaning people attach to events. It was an attempt to create middle ground. Johnny paused again before answering. He said coexistence is possible, but it requires openness from all sides. He suggested that in his case, openness sometimes felt conditional. His voice remained calm, but his cadence slowed. Each word felt deliberate. The audience shifted slightly, some murmurs, not loud enough to disrupt the conversation but noticeable enough to register. It wasn't applause or disapproval. It was the sound of people processing. Whoopi then addressed something more directly. She said that one of the challenges of being a public figure is that perception cannot be controlled entirely. She acknowledged that this can feel unfair. But she also pointed out that public platforms, including legal proceedings broadcast live, invite scrutiny by nature. At that point, Johnny's composure remained intact, but his expression hardened just slightly. He said that while he did not choose for every detail to become public spectacle, he also felt compelled to defend himself publicly because private resolution was no longer possible. He emphasized that he had tried, at different points, to resolve matters quietly. There was a careful balance here. No one was interrupting. No one was raising their voice. But the emotional undercurrent had become unmistakable. Sunny asked whether he believes the public conversation would have been different if social media had not amplified every moment. This question shifted the discussion toward the role of digital culture. Johnny responded more easily to that topic. He said social media creates acceleration. He described how clips circulate without context and how narratives solidify quickly. He acknowledged that online platforms amplify support and criticism alike. His tone during this portion was less defensive and more reflective. Whoopi agreed with that point, noting that the speed of social media can complicate already complex situations. For a brief moment, there was alignment at the table. Heads nodded. The audience relaxed slightly. But then Whoopi added something that reintroduced tension. She said that while social media amplifies narratives, it doesn't create underlying issues. She pointed out that the core questions raised during the trial existed before the internet reacted to them. Johnny inhaled slowly before responding. He said he doesn't deny that broader societal issues exist. However, he maintained that individuals should not be used as vessels for those debates without careful consideration of facts. That line felt sharper than previous responses. It wasn't hostile, but it was firmer. Sunny leaned back slightly, folding her hands on the table. She asked whether he believes public figures have any responsibility to acknowledge the impact of their situations on movements or advocacy groups that were closely watching the case. Johnny answered by saying responsibility must be grounded in truth. He said he cannot take responsibility for interpretations that he believes misrepresent events. He added that he empathizes with anyone affected by issues of abuse or power imbalance, but he cannot accept narratives he disputes. The audience remained silent again. At this point, you could see the careful calibration happening in real time. Whoopi glanced briefly toward the producer area off-camera, a subtle acknowledgement of timing constraints. Live television always operates within a clock, no matter how layered the discussion becomes. Still, she pressed once more, though gently. She said that empathy can sometimes be expressed without admission of wrongdoing. She asked whether he sees value in that distinction. Johnny's response was measured, but visibly strained. He said empathy is important, and he hopes his work moving forward reflects humanity and compassion. But he also reiterated that he cannot apologize for something he maintains he did not do. His voice didn't rise, but the firmness was unmistakable. There it was, the clearest dividing line of the conversation so far. The audience reacted with a small, scattered applause, quickly fading. It wasn't overwhelming, but it punctuated the moment. Whoopi nodded slowly. She didn't argue further. Instead, she said that conversations like this are complicated, especially in a public forum. She thanked him for staying in the discussion. Her tone suggested both acknowledgement and subtle boundary setting. Johnny responded with a brief nod and a quiet, of course. But his expression showed fatigue. Not anger. Not hostility. Fatigue. Alyssa then transitioned carefully toward his upcoming projects, signaling an attempt to guide the segment towards safer ground as the clock ticked down. Johnny spoke about future work with more animation in his voice than earlier in the discussion. The tension didn't disappear, but it softened slightly as the focus returned to art rather than accountability. Still, the exchange lingered in the air. What viewers had just witnessed wasn't an explosive confrontation. It was something more nuanced. Two experienced public figures standing firm in their perspectives, navigating disagreement within the constraints of live daytime television. And as the segment moved toward its final minutes, the question wasn't whether voices would rise. They hadn't, but whether the conversation would find a resolution or simply settle into respectful distance. As the segment moved into its final stretch before the commercial break, the atmosphere in the studio felt noticeably different from the upbeat energy that had opened the interview. The shift wasn't dramatic, but it was undeniable. The conversation had traveled through careful disagreement, and both Johnny Depp and Whoopi Goldberg seemed aware that they were now navigating the closing moments of a very delicate exchange. Alyssa continued steering the discussion toward Johnny's upcoming creative work, asking about the collaborative process on set and what he looks for in directors now that he has experienced both sides of the camera. For a few minutes, the tension eased. Johnny described the importance of trust between cast and crew, speaking in a more animated and relaxed tone than he had during the accountability discussion. His hands moved more naturally again, and he even smiled when recounting a light moment from filming. The audience responded with soft laughter at one anecdote, and the room felt lighter, though not entirely reset. It was clear that everyone understood what had just taken place. Even while the topic changed, the earlier exchange remained part of the emotional backdrop. Whoopi allowed this portion of the conversation to unfold without interruption. She listened, nodding occasionally, and let Johnny finish his story fully before stepping back in. Her timing was deliberate. She waited until the laughter faded before speaking again. She acknowledged his passion for storytelling and said that creativity can often provide space for reflection. Then, in a tone that was less confrontational and more reflective than earlier, she added that public conversations also require reflection from all sides. It wasn't a question this time. It was more of a closing observation. Johnny's expression shifted subtly. The smile that had returned during the film discussion softened. He nodded once and said that reflection is something he takes seriously. He explained that the past few years forced him to examine many aspects of his life, both personal and professional. His voice was steady, but there was a quiet weight to his words. Sunny asked one final question related to growth. She phrased it carefully, asking what he hopes audiences take away, not just from his new work, but from the way he has navigated public scrutiny. It was a broad question, offering him space to define his own narrative. Johnny paused before answering. He looked out briefly toward the audience and then back to the panel. He said he hopes people remember that human beings are complex. He emphasized that no one should be reduced to a single chapter of their life. His tone wasn't defensive this time. It was reflective. The audience responded with a modest but sustained round of applause. It wasn't enthusiastic cheering. It felt more like acknowledgement, recognition of a measured statement at the end of a tense conversation. Whoopi thanked him for that answer. She then addressed the broader audience, noting that difficult conversations are part of what the show does. She said the goal is never to attack, but to explore. The phrasing felt intentional, almost as if she were subtly addressing viewers who might interpret the exchange as confrontational. Johnny nodded again, offering a quiet, "I appreciate that." But his body language remained somewhat guarded. His shoulders were squared, and his hands stayed clasped together. The earlier ease had not fully returned. Alyssa gave details about his upcoming film release date and where viewers could find it. That practical information served as a clear sign that the segment was closing. The producers likely signaled the remaining time through the usual off-camera cues. Before wrapping, Whoopi offered one final comment. She said that live television can be unpredictable because real conversations don't always fit neatly into promotional soundbites. She thanked Johnny for staying engaged even when the discussion became challenging. Her tone was calm and controlled, but there was a layer of firmness beneath it, a subtle reminder that the show would not shy away from tough topics. Johnny responded politely. He thanked the panel for the opportunity to speak and said he believes dialogue is important, even when perspectives differ. He did not elaborate further. His words were concise, almost economical compared to earlier responses. As the segment officially ended and the show cut toward commercial, the audience applauded again, this time more broadly, signaling the formal close rather than reacting to a specific statement. The applause carried a sense of release. The tension that had built gradually throughout the interview seemed to dissipate slightly as the cameras pulled back. However, even in those final seconds before the break, viewers at home could likely sense that this wasn't a routine celebrity appearance. It had been professional. It had remained controlled. But it had also exposed a clear philosophical divide between host and guest. When the show returned from commercial later in the hour, the panel did not immediately revisit the exchange. They transitioned to the next topic as scheduled. Still, the earlier discussion lingered in the studio atmosphere. The co-hosts appeared composed, but slightly more serious than usual. There was less casual banter between segments. For those watching closely, it was clear that the disagreement had not been about volume or interruption. No one stormed off. No voices were raised. The tension had come from something quieter, a refusal on both sides to concede their framing of the issue. Johnny Depp had maintained that he cannot accept narratives he believes misrepresent his experience. Whoopi Goldberg had maintained that public platforms have a responsibility to ask direct questions about impact and accountability. Neither backed away from those positions. And that is what made the exchange feel significant. It wasn't dramatic in a theatrical sense. It was significant because it showed two public figures, both seasoned and media-savvy, navigating a disagreement in real time without losing composure. There were moments when the conversation could have escalated further, particularly when empathy and apology were discussed. But both sides stopped short of crossing into open confrontation. As the hour progressed and other topics filled the airtime, viewers at home likely replayed portions of the exchange in their minds. The stillness of the audience, the careful pauses, the shift in body language, the firmness in certain responses. By the time the credits rolled at the end of the show, it was clear that the Johnny Depp appearance would be remembered less for film promotion and more for the philosophical clash that unfolded at the table. And while the studio lights dimmed and the audience began filing out, the real conversation was only beginning, because moments like this rarely stay confined to the studio where they happen. By the time the show reached its closing minutes and the credits began to roll, the energy in the studio had settled into something calm but reflective. There was no dramatic aftermath on stage, no visible frustration between the hosts, no abrupt departure from Johnny Depp. Instead, what lingered was the unmistakable sense that viewers had witnessed a serious exchange, one that didn't rely on raised voices or spectacle, but on firm disagreement delivered in measured tones. As the cameras widened for the final shot of the panel, Whoopi Goldberg maintained her usual composure. She thanked the audience for tuning in, teased the next day's guests, and offered the standard sign-off that longtime viewers recognize instantly. Johnny remained seated until the applause cue swelled, then stood, offering polite handshakes and brief nods to the co-hosts. There was no visible hostility. The gestures were professional, cordial, and controlled. The studio audience, which had been notably quiet during the most tense moments of the discussion, responded with full applause at the end. It felt less like a reaction to a specific point, and more like a release of collective tension. Live audiences often mirror the emotional rhythm of a segment, and this one clearly understood that what had just happened was more serious than the average promotional interview. As the broadcast cut away, viewers at home were left with an exchange that didn't provide easy resolution. There had been no apology demanded, no accusation amplified, no argument spiraling out of control. Instead, there had been a steady, layered conversation about responsibility, perception, and public dialogue. Within minutes of the episode airing, social media began reflecting that divide. Some viewers praised Whoopi for asking direct questions they felt needed to be addressed. Others applauded Johnny for standing firm and articulating his perspective without losing composure. The reaction wasn't unified, and in many ways, that mirrored the tone of the segment itself. Clips of the moment where empathy and apology were discussed circulated quickly. Short excerpts highlighted Johnny's statement that he cannot apologize for something he maintains he did not do. Other clips focused on Whoopi's assertion that accountability conversations are part of public discourse, whether comfortable or not. As often happens, condensed clips captured only fragments of the broader conversation, prompting renewed debate online. Later that afternoon, entertainment outlets began publishing recaps. Most described the exchange as tense but respectful. Analysts noted that neither side appeared combative. Instead, the tension came from a clear philosophical difference. Commentators pointed out that this was not a viral meltdown or walk-off scenario. It was a disciplined disagreement. Behind the scenes, according to sources familiar with daytime television production, there was no indication that the segment had gone off the rails. Producers expect challenging discussions when controversial public figures appear. From a broadcast standpoint, the conversation stayed within professional boundaries. Time cues were respected. No one spoke over another excessively. The pacing remained controlled. The following day, during a brief moment on the show, Whoopi addressed viewer feedback indirectly. Without revisiting specific statements, she reiterated that the program's purpose is to explore difficult conversations from multiple angles. Her tone was steady, consistent with how she had moderated the previous day's exchange. She did not single out Johnny or defend herself explicitly. Instead, she reinforced the broader mission of the show. Johnny, for his part, did not issue any public criticism of the interview. In subsequent promotional appearances, he remained focused on his work. When briefly asked by another outlet about the talk show moment, he reportedly described it as a conversation, emphasizing that differences in perspective are part of public life. That understated characterization matched his demeanor during the segment itself. What stood out most to many viewers wasn't any single sentence, but the pacing of the disagreement. It built gradually. It never tipped into chaos. It reflected something more common, and perhaps more uncomfortable, than dramatic television. Two experienced figures refusing to adjust their framing of a sensitive issue. The studio audience reaction also became part of the post-show discussion. Observers noted how quiet the room had grown during the most pointed exchanges. In live television, silence can be more telling than applause. It suggested that viewers were listening carefully rather than choosing sides in the moment. In the days that followed, opinion columns examined whether daytime talk shows have an obligation to press guests on controversial histories. Some argued that celebrity platforms should not become spaces for unchallenged image repair. Others argued that once legal matters conclude, promotional interviews should focus on work rather than revisiting disputes. That debate extended far beyond this one segment. For longtime viewers of The View, however, the exchange felt consistent with the show's format. The panel has always blended pop culture with politics and social commentary. The balance doesn't always satisfy every viewer, but it is part of the program's identity. Johnny's appearance simply placed that format under a brighter spotlight because of the high-profile nature of his past legal battles. Importantly, there was no breakdown in decorum. No host lost control of the conversation. No guest exited prematurely. The tension remained within the boundaries of live daytime television, serious, pointed at times, but never inappropriate for the audience. In many ways, that's what made the Showdown feel significant. It wasn't about spectacle. It was about tone. It demonstrated how quickly a routine interview can shift when unresolved public conversations are brought to the table. And it showed how both host and guests can maintain composure while firmly standing by their positions. For viewers watching at home, the lasting impression likely depended on where they already stood. Some saw a host fulfilling her responsibility to ask difficult questions. Others saw an actor defending himself against narratives he believes are unfair. The segment didn't attempt to resolve that divide. It simply revealed it. And that's often how real live television works. Not every disagreement ends with clarity. Sometimes it ends with acknowledgement and understanding that perspectives differ, and that conversation itself is part of the process. If you watched the episode, you probably felt that gradual tightening of the room. You likely noticed the shift in body language, the careful pauses, the quieter audience. You saw how both Johnny Depp and Whoopi Goldberg chose their words carefully, aware that millions were listening. Moments like this remind us why live talk shows remain relevant. They create space for unscripted exchanges that don't always follow a neat arc. They expose the friction that can exist between personal narrative and public responsibility. And they do it in real time. Now, we want to hear from you. Do you think the questions were fair? Do you believe the conversation struck the right balance between accountability and respect? Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Table Turn for more narration-based talk show stories.